There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a place when something has been deliberately hidden. Not the peaceful quiet of abandonment, not the restful hush of a summer afternoon, but something heavier, something that seems to press down on you like a physical weight, as if the very ground beneath your feet is keeping a secret it never wanted to tell. In the summer of 1987, a team of restoration workers arrived at Belle Grove, a sprawling plantation estate in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, to begin what should have been a routine renovation project. The work was straightforward enough. Remove the modern flooring that had been installed decades earlier, restore the original hardwood floors beneath, and return the house to something approximating its 19th century appearance. What they discovered beneath those floorboards would unravel a mystery so disturbing, so deeply human in its tragedy, that it would force an entire community to reckon with a truth that had been buried quite literally for more than a century. Before we continue with the story of Belle Grove and the men who uncovered its darkest secret, if you're new to our channel, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's begin. The Shenandoah Valley in the 1980s was experiencing a quiet renaissance. The Civil War had left deep scars across Virginia, scars that were visible not just in the landscape, but in the collective memory of the people who lived there. Nearly 130 years had passed since Appomattox, since Lee had surrendered to Grant, since the old order had collapsed into dust and ashes. But the valley still carried the weight of that history. You could see it in the way certain families held themselves apart from others, in the way some conversations would stop abruptly when strangers entered a room, in the way the past seemed to linger in the very air. By the 1980s, however, something was changing. Historic preservation had become fashionable among wealthy collectors and cultural institutions. There was a growing recognition that the old houses and plantations of the South were not just relics of a shameful past, but also valuable historical documents, physical records of how people had lived, worked, and thought in earlier centuries. If you wanted to understand American history, you had to look at these buildings, had to study them carefully, had to try to read the stories they contained in their brick and mortar, in their floorboards and foundations. Belle Grove was one of the most significant properties in the valley. The main house was a Greek Revival mansion built in 1797, designed by a prominent architect from Philadelphia and constructed over the course of 3 years by enslaved workers and hired craftsmen. It stood 3 stories seminary in Virginials, with white columns that had weathered to a soft gray over the course of nearly 2 centuries, and windows that seemed to watch the world with a kind of weary indifference. The proportions were perfect, the kind of mathematical harmony that the Greeks had understood and that American architects of the late 18th century had tried to recreate. But like all old houses, Belle Grove had suffered the depredations of time and neglect. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked in several places, and the interior had been modified repeatedly over the decades with modern materials covering the original features. The estate sprawled across 280 acres of rolling hills and overgrown gardens. The main house was surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a thriving agricultural operation. Crumbling slave quarters, a collapsed tobacco barn, a brick springhouse that still held the chill of centuries, a small cemetery where generations of the Ashton family had been buried. The grounds were beautiful in a melancholy way, the kind of beauty that comes from abandonment, from the slow reclamation of human spaces by nature. The restoration project had been initiated by the Belle Grove Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving historic properties in the valley. The foundation had recently acquired the property from a family that had owned it for 3 generations, but had been unable to maintain it. The purchase price had been substantial, but the foundation had secured grants from the National Trust for Historic Preservation and from several private donors who believed in the importance of saving these buildings. The plan was ambitious. A complete restoration of the main house, including structural repairs, the removal of modern additions, and the restoration of the original interior features. The work would take several years and would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The restoration team was led by a man named Thomas Garrett, a meticulous contractor in his early 50s who had spent the last 20 years bringing old houses back to life. He was the kind of man who noticed things, the way wood grain told stories, how nail holes marked the passage of time, the significance of a single brick laid differently from its neighbors. He had a reputation for being thorough, sometimes to the point of obsessiveness. He would spend hours examining a single wall, running his hands over the plaster, studying the way the light fell on the surface, trying to understand how it had been constructed and what it might reveal about the people who had built it. Thomas had grown up in the valley, the son of a carpenter and a school teacher. His father had taught him to work with his hands, to respect materials, to understand that every job, no matter how small, deserved to be done properly. His mother had taught him to read widely and to think critically about the world. The combination of these 2 influences had made him an unusual contractor, someone who approached restoration work not just as a technical problem to be solved, but as a kind of historical investigation. Working alongside Thomas was his nephew David, a carpenter in his late 20s, who had inherited his uncle's eye for detail and his passion for understanding the past. David had grown up watching his uncle work, and he had decided early on that he wanted to follow in his footsteps. He had apprenticed with Thomas for 5 years, learning the craft of carpentry and the principles of historic restoration. By the time he arrived at Belle Grove, he was a skilled carpenter in his own right, capable of handling complex restoration work with precision and care. The rest of the crew consisted of 4 other men, each with their own skills and their own reasons for being there. There was Marcus Webb, an older man in his early 60s who had spent his entire life in the valley and knew its history the way other people knew their own names. Marcus had worked on construction projects throughout the region for 40 years, and he had a deep knowledge of local building practices and materials. More importantly, he had connections throughout the valley. He knew the families. He knew the stories. He knew which houses had been built when and by whom. There was also James Patterson, a young man from Richmond who had recently completed his apprenticeship and was eager to work on significant projects. James was energetic and enthusiastic, sometimes to the point of recklessness. He would occasionally skip steps or cut corners, and Thomas had to watch him carefully to make sure the work was being done properly. Then there was Robert Chen, a skilled mason who had been brought in specifically to work on the brick and stone elements of the house. Robert was quiet and methodical, the kind of man who could spend an entire day working on a single section of wall and be perfectly content. He had a deep understanding of historic masonry techniques and could identify the age and origin of bricks by sight. Finally, there was William Bill Hutchkins, a general laborer who handled the heavy work, moving materials, demolition, cleanup. Bill was in his mid-40s and had worked on construction sites throughout his life. He was strong and reliable, and he had a dry sense of humor that helped keep the crew's spirits up during the long, tedious work of restoration. The work began in June 1987 with the team focusing on the main floor of the house. The original hardwood floors had been covered decades earlier with cheap linoleum and carpet, the kind of materials that had been popular in the 1950s and 1960s, when people had wanted to modernize their homes and had not understood or valued the historical significance of what lay beneath. The plan was to carefully remove these layers and restore the wood beneath. It was tedious, unglamorous work, the kind that no one thinks about when they admire a restored historic home. But it was necessary, and Thomas Garrett approached it with the same care he brought to everything. The first week passed without incident. The team removed carpet and linoleum from the parlor, the dining room, and the entrance hall. They found what they expected to find. Water damage in places where the roof had leaked. Wood rot in the corners where moisture had accumulated. The occasional artifact from the 20th century, a penny from 1952, a child's marble, a button from a coat, the kind of small debris that accumulates in the cracks of old houses over the course of decades. Thomas documented everything, photographing each discovery and making notes about where items had been found and what they might indicate about the history of the house. The work was physically demanding. The linoleum had been glued down with a strong adhesive, and removing it required patience and careful work to avoid damaging the wood beneath. The carpet was easier to remove, but it was heavy and dusty, and the work of pulling it up and hauling it out of the house left everyone covered in dust and debris. By the end of each day, the crew was exhausted, their hands blistered, their backs aching. But on the morning of June 23rd, as David and Marcus worked on removing the flooring in what had once been the master bedroom on the second floor, something changed. The work that had been routine and predictable suddenly became something else entirely. The floorboard came up more easily than the others. David had been working methodically, using a pry bar to lift each board, when this one shifted with almost no resistance. It was as if it had been waiting for someone to find it, as if it had been loosely placed there deliberately, waiting for the day when someone would come along and discover what lay beneath. David exchanged a glance with Marcus. There was something in that glance, a moment of recognition, a shared understanding that something was wrong. Marcus was already kneeling beside David, his weathered face creased with the kind of concentration that comes from decades of noticing things, from paying attention to the small details that most people overlook. "That's not right," Marcus said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Concern, perhaps, or a kind of wariness that comes from recognizing that you've stumbled onto something you weren't meant to find. Beneath the floorboard was a gap. Not the normal space between joists, not the kind of empty space that you would expect to find in an old house, but something deliberate. Someone had created a hollow space beneath the floor and then carefully replaced the board on top of it. The gap was perhaps 2 feet long and 8 in wide, and it was lined with what appeared to be oilcloth, yellowed and brittle with age. The oilcloth had been carefully folded to create a kind of protective lining, and it was clear that whoever had created this hiding place had done so with considerable care and attention to detail. David called for his uncle. Thomas came down from the second floor, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned not to rush toward the unexpected. He had been working on the third floor, examining the attic space when David's call came. He descended the stairs carefully, his mind already working through the possibilities. A hidden space in an old house could mean many things. It could be a hiding place created during the Civil War. It could be a space where valuables had been stored. It could be evidence of bootlegging during Prohibition, Or it could be something else entirely, something that would require careful investigation to understand. Thomas stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, studying the scene. David was kneeling beside the gap, his hands carefully positioned, but not touching anything. Marcus was standing a few feet away, his expression grave. The afternoon light was streaming through the windows, and dust motes danced in the beams, creating an almost ethereal quality to the scene. "Don't touch anything else," Thomas said. His voice was calm, but there was an undertone of urgency. "Not yet." What followed was a careful, methodical process that would have impressed an archaeologist. Thomas photographed the space from multiple angles using a camera he kept in his truck for documenting the work. He photographed the floorboard in place, then photographed it after it had been removed. He photographed the gap from above, from the side, from every angle that might reveal something about how it had been constructed and what it had contained. He made detailed notes about the position of the floorboard, the condition of the wood, the way the oilcloth had been arranged. He noted the dimensions of the gap, the type of wood used in the floorboard, the style of the nails that had held it in place. He was creating a complete record of the discovery, understanding that this first moment of finding something hidden was crucial, and that once the contents were removed, the context would be lost forever. Only after he had documented everything did he carefully reach into the gap and remove the contents. His movements were slow and deliberate, his hands gentle, as if he were handling something infinitely precious and fragile. There were 3 items. The first was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded to a soft brown, its pages yellowed to the color of old bone. The leather was supple despite its age, suggesting that it had been well cared for, protected from the elements. The pages were filled with handwriting, precise, elegant handwriting in black ink that had faded slightly over the decades, but remained legible. The second item was a bundle of letters tied together with a ribbon that had once been blue, but had faded to the color of ash. The letters were written on paper that was thin and fragile, the kind of paper that had been used in the 19th century. The envelopes were addressed in the same precise handwriting as the journal. The third item was a small wooden box, no larger than a man's hand, with a brass clasp that had turned green with verdigris. The wood was dark, possibly mahogany or walnut, and it was decorated with a simple inlaid pattern. The box was locked, and there was no key visible among the other items. Thomas set these items carefully on a clean cloth that he had brought up from his truck, and he stepped back. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the June heat pressed against the windows, and the old house creaked and settled around them, as if it too was waiting to see what would happen next. "We need to call someone," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but his hands were trembling slightly. "This isn't something we should be handling on our own. This is historical material. It needs to be preserved properly." Thomas nodded slowly. He was already thinking ahead to the Preservation Foundation, to the Historical Society, to the questions that would inevitably follow. But before he made any calls, before he involved anyone else, he needed to know what they had found. Just a quick look, he told himself. Just enough to understand what we're dealing with. Just enough to know if this is something that needs to be handled with special care. He opened the journal carefully, aware that the pages might crumble at his touch. The leather cover was stiff, and it took some gentle pressure to open it. The first page was blank, but the second page contained a title written in the same precise handwriting. A true account of events that occurred at Belgrove in the year of our Lord 1863. Written by Catherine Ashton, wife of Henry Ashton. in the hope that truth might survive even when justice cannot. Thomas read this slowly, understanding that he was about to enter into the private thoughts of someone who had lived more than a century ago. He turned the page carefully and began to read the first entry. The handwriting was precise and elegant, the kind of penmanship that had been taught in schools more than a century ago. The first entry was dated March 15, 1863. Thomas read the first few lines aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have committed an act today that will haunt me until my dying breath. The weight of what I have done presses upon my chest like a stone, and I fear that God Himself has turned His face away from me. I write this account not in hopes of forgiveness, for I do not deserve it, but as a record of the truth. Someone must know. Someone must remember what was done here in the name of preserving a way of life that was already dying." The three men stood in silence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, though the summer heat outside had not changed. Outside, the sound of the other workers continued, the scrape of tools, the murmur of voices, the ordinary sounds of a day's work. But in this room, in this moment, something had shifted. A secret that had been kept for 124 years was beginning to emerge from the darkness. Thomas made the decision to bring in Dr. Elenina Hayes, a historian from the University of Virginia, who specialized in the social history of the antebellum South. He knew her slightly. She had consulted on another restoration project he'd worked on 5 years earlier, a plantation house in Albemarle County. He had been impressed by her knowledge, her careful methodology, and her ability to understand the human dimensions of history. When he called her that afternoon, describing what they'd found in vague terms, she agreed to come to Bell Grove the next morning. "I can be there by 9000, she said. "Don't let anyone else handle the materials. Don't open anything else. Just leave them exactly as you found them. I'll bring proper archival supplies." Dr. Eleanor Hayes arrived at 900 on June 24th, driving a battered Honda Civic that had seen better days. She was a woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She wore gloves as she examined the items, handling them with the reverence of someone who understood that they were holding history in her hands. She had brought a small case with her containing archival supplies, acid-free paper, cotton gloves, a magnifying glass, and several other tools of the historian's trade. She spent the first hour simply looking at the items without touching them, studying them from different angles, making notes in a small leather notebook. Then, very carefully, she began to examine them more closely. "This is significant," she said finally, looking up from the journal. "Very significant. The leather is good quality, which suggests that whoever wrote this had access to resources. The paper is also good quality, not cheap paper, not the kind that would have been used for everyday correspondence. This was created by someone who wanted it to last, who wanted the record to survive." "What kind of something?" David asked. "What are we dealing with here?" Dr. Hayes looked up from the journal, her eyes distant. "That's what we need to find out. But I can tell you this much. Whoever wrote this was deeply disturbed by something that happened in March of 1863. The handwriting is shaky in places, particularly in this first entry. You can see where the pen has pressed harder into the paper, where the writer's emotional state was affecting their physical control. This is someone who was in distress." She carefully opened the wooden box. The lock was old and corroded, but it gave way with gentle pressure. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been wine white but had yellowed with age, was a daguerreotype, a photograph so old that the image had faded to a ghostly impression. It showed a woman young, perhaps in her 20s, with dark hair and a serious expression. She was wearing a simple dress, and her hands were folded in her lap. There was something about her eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera, directly at anyone who would view the photograph more than a century later, with an expression that was impossible to read. It was not quite sadness, not quite resignation, but something more complex, a kind of awareness perhaps of something that was about to happen or something that had already happened. "Do you know who she is?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," Dr. Hayes said. "But we're going to find out. This is the key to everything. Whoever this woman is, she's the reason these items were hidden. She's the reason someone felt compelled to write this journal and hide it beneath the floorboards." Over the next week, the restoration work at Belle Grove came to a halt. The room where the items had been found was sealed off with plastic sheeting, and a "Do Not Disturb" sign was posted on the door. The other workers were told that there had been a discovery of historical significance and that the work would resume once the materials had been properly documented and studied. Dr. Hayes began the painstaking work of researching the house's history. She consulted property records at the courthouse in Harrisonburg, examined census data from the 19th century, searched through newspaper archives at the library, and reviewed the few surviving documents from the plantation's operation. She interviewed Marcus Webb, who knew the local history and whose own family had roots in the valley stretching back generations. She also reached out to other historians and archivists asking for help in tracking down information about the Ashton family and Belle Grove. What emerged was a picture of Belle Grove as it had been in 1863. The house had been owned by a man named Henry Ashton, a wealthy planter whose family had lived in the valley for 3 generations. The Ashton family had arrived in Virginia in the 1760s, and they had gradually accumulated land and wealth through a combination of agricultural production and slave labor. By the time Henry Ashton took over the management of the estate in 1840, Belle Grove was one of the most significant properties in the valley. Ashton had been a slave owner, though by 1863, the institution of slavery was collapsing around him. The Union Army had passed through the valley multiple times during the Civil War, and many enslaved people had fled north, seeking freedom. The war had disrupted the normal patterns of agricultural production, and the economy of the South was in chaos. For a man like Henry Ashton, the world was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ashton had died in 1864, and the house had passed to his son William, who had struggled to maintain the property during Reconstruction. William had eventually sold the house to a northern investor in 1889, and it had changed hands several times since then, eventually falling into disrepair before being acquired by the Preservation Foundation. But the journal was the key. Donna Hayes spent hours with it, carefully photographing each page with a high-quality camera, transcribing the handwriting into a word processor, cross-referencing the dates and names with historical records. She worked late into the evenings, sitting at a table in the Belle Grove Library, surrounded by books and documents, trying to piece together the story that Catherine Ashton had written down more than a century ago. The journal had been written by a woman named Catherine Ashton, the wife of Henry Ashton. Catherine had been born in Philadelphia in 1820, the daughter of a merchant family with abolitionist sympathies. Her father had been involved in the Underground Railroad, and her mother had been a supporter of women's rights and other progressive causes. Catherine had grown up in an environment where slavery was seen as a moral evil, where the idea of one human being owning another was considered fundamentally wrong. She had married Henry Ashton in 1845 against her family's wishes. Henry had come to Philadelphia on business, and he had met Catherine at a social gathering. He had been charming and attentive, and Catherine had been drawn to him. Her family had tried to dissuade her from the marriage, warning her about the South and about what it would mean to live in a slave-owning society. But Catherine had been young and in love, and she had believed that she could change Henry's views, that she could bring him around to a more enlightened perspective. She had been wrong. For the first 15 years of her marriage, Catherine had kept her views to herself. She had managed the household, raised 2 children, a son named Robert and a daughter named Elizabeth, and played the role of a Southern planter's wife. She had attended social gatherings, had hosted dinner parties, had participated in the life of the Valley's planter class. But the journal revealed that this compliance had come at a cost. Page after page was filled with her private anguish, her growing horror at the system in which she lived, her increasing sense of moral corruption. The entries became more frequent and more desperate as the 1850s progressed. Catherine wrote about the enslaved people who worked in her house, their names, their faces, their stories. She wrote about a woman named Ruth, who had been brought to Belle Grove as a young girl and had worked in the kitchen for 30 years. She wrote about Ruth's daughter, Sarah, who had been born into slavery and had grown up in the quarters behind the main house. Catherine's entries about Sarah were particularly poignant. She described Sarah as intelligent, quick-witted, and beautiful. She wrote about teaching Sarah to read in secret, about the risk she was taking in doing so, about the way Sarah's face would light up when she understood a new word or concept. She wrote about the conversations they would have, about the questions Sarah would ask about the world beyond the valley, about freedom and what it might mean. But there was also a note of growing anxiety in Catherine's entries about Sarah. She seemed to understand, even before the events of 1863, that Sarah's intelligence and beauty made her vulnerable. In a society built on slavery, a young woman who was intelligent and beautiful and of mixed race was a threat to the established order. She was a living reminder of the relationships between white men and enslaved women. Relationships that were supposed to be invisible, unacknowledged, denied. And then in early 1863, something changed. The entry dated March 10, 1863 was brief and cryptic. Henry has made a decision that I cannot support. He believes that the war will be lost, that the South cannot prevail. He is making arrangements to protect his interests, to ensure that when the Union comes, we will not be left destitute. But the cost of his plan is something I cannot bear. I have tried to argue with him, but he will not listen. He says that I do not understand the complexities of his situation, that I am being naive and sentimental. Perhaps he is right, but I know that what he is proposing is wrong. The next entry, dated March 15th, was the one Thomas had read aloud in the bedroom. But there were more entries after that, each one revealing more of the terrible truth. March 18th. I have tried to convince myself that there was no other way. I have tried to believe that Henry's reasoning was sound, that what he has done was necessary. But I cannot lie to myself any longer. What we have done is a sin against God and against humanity. The weight of it is crushing me. I cannot eat. I cannot sleep. I lie awake at night and think about what will happen to her, and I feel as though I am going mad. March 22nd. Sarah is gone. I do not know where she has been taken, and I am afraid to ask. Henry will not speak of it. The other servants whisper among themselves, but they will not tell me what they know. Ruth has not left the kitchen in 3 days. She sits at the table and stares at nothing, and when I try to speak to her, she does not respond. I tried to comfort her, but she turned away from me. I cannot blame her. I am complicit in this. I have done nothing to stop it. I have been a coward. April 3rd. I have made a decision. I will write down what happened, and I will hide this account where it cannot be found until long after we are all gone. Someone must know the truth. Someone must remember what was done here in the name of preserving a way of life that was already dying. I cannot save Sarah. I cannot undo what has been done. But I can ensure that her existence is not completely erased. That someone someday will know that she lived, that she mattered, that what happened to her was wrong. Dr. Hayes read these passages aloud to Thomas and David, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. The implications were becoming clear, though the journal had not yet explicitly stated what had happened to Sarah. "We need to find out more," Dr. Hayes said. "There are gaps in the narrative. Catherine is being deliberately vague about certain details. Perhaps because she couldn't bring herself to write them down, or perhaps because she was afraid that, if she wrote them explicitly, the guilt would become unbearable. But the letters might be more explicit. The letters might tell us what actually happened." Dr. Hayes began to carefully examine the bundle of letters. They were written on thin paper, the kind that had been used in the 19th century, and they were addressed in a precise, formal hand. The envelopes bore postmarks from various towns in Virginia and North Carolina, and the dates range from March 1863 to April 1863. The first letter was dated March 20th, 1863, and it was addressed to H. Ashton Issa, Belgrove, Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. The letter was written in a formal professional tone, but the content was deeply disturbing. Dr. Hayes read it aloud. "Dear Mr. Ashton, I have received your letter of March 15th, and I understand the delicate nature of your situation. I can assure you that I am experienced in handling such matters with the utmost discretion. The arrangement you propose is not uncommon, particularly in these uncertain times, and I believe I can offer a solution that will address your concerns while protecting the interests of all parties involved. I have a colleague, Dr. Silas Croft, who operates a private establishment in western North Carolina. The facility specializes in the care of individuals with nervous conditions and moral deficiencies. It is a respectable institution, well maintained and properly staffed. Dr. Croft has considerable experience in handling cases similar to the one you describe, and he is entirely trustworthy. He understands the importance of discretion and can assure complete confidentiality. The young woman in question could be admitted under an assumed name. Her records would be sealed and kept separate from the main files. No one in your community would ever know of her whereabouts or her condition. She would be cared for, fed, and housed, and she would receive whatever medical attention might be necessary. In exchange, Dr. Croft would require a substantial payment, which I believe you indicated you were prepared to make. I await your response and can arrange the details of the transfer at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Dr. James Whitfield, physician and consultant, Richmond, Virginia. The room fell silent. David had gone pale. Marcus was staring at the letter as if he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. "My God," Thomas said quietly. "They were sending her away. They were sending her to an asylum. Not just an asylum," Dr. Hayes said, her voice heavy. "A private institution, a place where she could be hidden away, where no one would ever find her." And the language, nervous conditions, moral deficiencies, these were the euphemisms used to describe women who were considered problematic, women who didn't fit into society's expectations. She continued reading the letters. The second letter, dated March 25, 1863, was Henry's response to Dr. Whitfield. "Dear Dr. Whitfield, I am grateful for your prompt response and for your willingness to assist me in this matter. I have given considerable thought to your proposal, and I believe that the arrangement you describe is the best solution to my current difficulties. The young woman in question has become a source of considerable concern to me, and I believe that removal from this environment would be beneficial to her as well as to my family. I am prepared to make the financial arrangement you have proposed. I will transfer the sum of $500 to Dr. Croft's account upon receipt of confirmation that the young woman has been safely admitted to his facility. I would prefer that this transaction be completed within the next 2 weeks, as circumstances in this region are becoming increasingly unstable, and I wish to have this matter resolved before the situation deteriorates further. Please advise me of the arrangements and the expected date of transfer. Yours in confidence, Henry Ashton. Oh, 500, Marcus said, his voice hollow. That was a fortune in 1863. That was more than a year's wages for a laborer. He paid that much to have his own daughter locked away. We don't know for certain that she was his daughter, Dr. Hayes said carefully, but the implication is clear. And Catherine's journal confirms it. She refers to Sarah as his daughter in one of the later entries. The final letter in the bundle was dated April 5, 1863, and it was from Dr. Croft himself. Dear Mr. Ashton, I write to confirm that the young woman has been safely admitted to my facility under the name Sarah Wells. She arrived on April 3rd in good health, though somewhat distressed by the change in her circumstances. I have examined her thoroughly and have found no significant physical ailments. Her mental state is, as you indicated, somewhat unstable, but I believe that with proper treatment and care, she may achieve a state of relative stability over time. I have established a treatment regimen that includes rest, proper nutrition, and certain medicinal interventions that I have found to be effective in cases of this nature. She will be kept in a secure room on the 3rd floor of the facility, where she will be safe and where she will not be able to disturb the other patients. I have received the payment you transferred, and I can assure you that the young woman will be cared for as long as she remains in my facility. Should you wish to inquire about her progress, you may do so through Dr. Whitfield, who will serve as an intermediary. I would advise against any direct contact, as such contact might disrupt the treatment process. Respectfully, Dr. Silas Croft, Proprietor, Croft Asylum for Nervous Diseases, Asheville, North Carolina. Dr. Hayes sat back in her chair, the letters spread out before her. She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes as if she were trying to erase what she had just read. We need to find out what happened to Sarah, she said quietly. We need to know if she survived, if she ever escaped, if she ever found her way back home. We need to know if there's any record of her after 1863. But finding Sarah would prove to be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The asylum in North Carolina had burned down in 1889, taking most of its records with it. Dr. Silas Croft had died in 1875, and his family had scattered. The trail seemed to go cold almost immediately. However, Dr. Hayes was persistent. She was a historian, and historians are trained to follow threads, to pursue leads, to believe that the past leaves traces that can be found if you look hard enough. She contacted historical societies in North Carolina, placed advertisements in genealogy forums, and reached out to descendants of the Ashton family. She wrote letters to university archives and to private collectors of Civil War-era documents. She spent hours in libraries, searching through old newspapers on microfilm, looking for any mention of a woman named Sarah or Sarah Wells. And then, almost by accident, she found something. A woman named Patricia Croft, a great-great-granddaughter of Dr. Silas Croft, had been researching her family history and had come across some old documents in her grandmother's attic. Among them were several letters and a small journal that had belonged to her ancestor. Patricia had posted some of her findings on an early genealogy website, and Dr. Hayes had discovered the posting while searching for information about Dr. Croft. Dr. Hayes contacted Patricia, and Patricia agreed to send her copies of the documents. When they arrived, Dr. Hayes spent an entire night reading them. In one of the letters dated 1875, Dr. Croft had written to his wife about a patient who had been with him for many years. A young woman admitted under the name Sarah Wells, who had arrived in 1863 with no family and no prospects. The letter described her as intelligent but deeply troubled, prone to fits of melancholy and occasional violence. She has been a difficult patient, but I believe that with proper treatment and care, she may eventually achieve a state of relative stability. However, I must confess that I am not optimistic about her ultimate prognosis. Some individuals are simply too damaged by their circumstances to ever fully recover. But there was more. In Dr. Croft's journal, there was a brief entry dated June 1875, just before his death. The Wells girl escaped last week. She had been with us for 12 years, and I had begun to believe that she had accepted her situation. But she managed to obtain a key to the front gate. I suspect one of the servants gave it to her, and she simply walked away. I have made inquiries, but there is no trace of her. I suspect she may have attempted to return to Virginia, but I cannot be certain. It is a tragedy, really. She had nowhere to go, no family to receive her, no means of support. I fear for what may become of her. The discovery of this information sent Dr. Hayes on a new search. If Sarah had escaped in 1875 and had attempted to return to Virginia, there should be some record of her. She contacted the Virginia Historical Society again, this time with a specific name and date. She searched newspaper archives for any mention of a woman matching Sarah's description arriving in the valley in 1875 or 1876. And then she found it. In the Richmond Dispatch, dated October 15, 1875, there was a brief notice. A woman of mixed race, giving her name as Sarah Wells, was arrested in Stratton on charges of vagrancy and trespassing. She claimed to be a former resident of the valley and stated that she was attempting to locate family members. She was unable to provide documentation of her claims. The magistrate ordered her to leave the county within 24 hours. But that wasn't the end of the story. Dr. Hayes continued searching, and she found another notice. This one in a newspaper from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, dated November 1875. A woman named Sarah Wells has been admitted to the Harper's Ferry home for indigent women. She is believed to be in her 30s, though she appears older due to hardship. She has no family and no means of support. The home is seeking any information about her origins or relatives. The trail ended there. The Harper's Ferry home had closed in 1920, and its records had been lost in a fire. But Dr. Hayes had found enough to piece together what had happened. Sarah had escaped the asylum, had attempted to return to Virginia, had been turned away, and had ended up in a home for indigent women in West Virginia, where she had likely spent the rest of her life. Thomas Garrett stood at the window of the restoration office, looking out at the grounds of Belle Grove. The summer afternoon was fading into evening, and the old house seemed to settle into itself, as if it had finally released a burden it had been carrying for more than a century. Why did Catherine hide the journal? David asked. Why not destroy it? Why leave it for someone to find? Because, Dr. Hayes said slowly, she needed someone to know. She needed the truth to survive. Even if it took 100 years. She couldn't save Sarah. But she could ensure that Sarah wouldn't be completely forgotten. That's why she hid the journal beneath the floorboards. She knew that someday someone would find it. And when they did, they would know what had happened here. She paused, looking at the daguerreotype of the young woman. And I think there's something else. I think Catherine was trying to create a record that would survive even if the official records didn't. She was creating a counter-narrative to the one that Henry and Dr. Croft and all the others would have created. She was saying this happened. This woman existed. This was wrong, and I'm going to make sure that someone knows about it. The discovery at Belgrove became a local sensation. The Preservation Foundation held a press conference, and the story was picked up by newspapers across Virginia and beyond. Hidden Journal reveals dark secret of historic plantation. The headlines read, ASOM records shed light on Civil War-era family tragedy. Woman's journal documents forced separation of enslaved family. The story spread beyond the local news. The Washington Post sent a reporter to interview Dr. Hayes and Thomas Garrett. The New York Times published an article about the discovery. National Public Radio produced a segment about the find. Within a matter of weeks, Belgrove had become a focal point for discussions about slavery, about the Civil War, about the hidden histories of the American South. But the reaction in the local community was more complicated. Some people were fascinated by the historical discovery. They came to Belgrove to see the house, to view the journal and letters, to try to understand what had happened more than a century ago. Others were defensive, arguing that Henry Ashton had been a man of his time, that his actions, while regrettable, were not unusual for the era. Still others were angry. Angry that the story had been kept hidden for so long. Angry that it had taken the accidental discovery of a hidden journal to bring the truth to light. There were also people who questioned the authenticity of the documents. Some argued that the journal and letters were forgeries, that they had been created by someone in recent years to generate publicity for the restoration project. Others suggested that the documents had been misinterpreted, that Catherine's account was unreliable, that we couldn't really know what had happened. But Dr. Hayes was able to address these concerns. She brought in a document expert from the Library of Congress who examined the journal and letters and confirmed that they were genuine 19th century documents. The paper, the ink, the binding, all of it was consistent with materials that would have been used in the 1860s. The handwriting was analyzed and compared to other known examples of Catherine Ashton's writing, and the expert confirmed that it was the same hand. Marcus Webb, the older member of the restoration crew, found himself at the center of these debates. His family had lived in the valley for generations, and he had relatives who had been enslaved at Belgrove and other plantations in the area. He gave several interviews to local newspapers and to historians, sharing what he knew about the valley's history and about the families who had been torn apart by slavery and war. My great-grandmother was enslaved at a plantation about 5 miles from here, he told one interviewer. She escaped north in 1862 and never saw her family again. She died in Philadelphia in 1910, and she never knew what happened to her children. Stories like Sarah's, they're not unusual. They're just usually not documented. We don't have journals and letters. We just have silence and absence. We have the knowledge that people disappeared, that families were separated, that lives were destroyed. But we don't have the details. We don't have the names. We don't have the voices of the people who experienced it. So when we find something like this, when we find Catherine's journal, it's like finding a voice that has been silent for more than 100 years. It's like Sarah is finally able to speak. The Preservation Foundation decided to expand the scope of the restoration project. They hired Dr. Hayes as a consultant, and they began a comprehensive historical investigation of Belgrove's past. They interviewed descendants of the Ashton family, searched for records of the enslaved people who had lived and worked at the plantation, and attempted to piece together a more complete picture of the house's history. They discovered that Catherine Ashton had lived for another 43 years after the events of 1863. She had remained married to Henry, had raised her 2 children, and had died in 1906 at the age of 86. She had never publicly revealed what she knew about Sarah's fate, but in her will, she had left a substantial sum of money to a school for colored children in Richmond, with a note that the donation was made in memory of those whose names have been forgotten. Henry Ashton had died in 1864 during the final year of the Civil War. He had been thrown from a horse while riding near the house and had died of his injuries 3 days later. Some people in the community whispered that it was divine judgment, that God had punished him for what he had done to Sarah. Others simply said it was an accident, the kind of thing that happened to men who rode horses carelessly. As the restoration work continued, the team made other discoveries. In the cellar of the house, they found a small room that had been sealed off, its door covered with plaster and paint. When they opened it, they found evidence that it had been used as a hiding place. There were blankets, a chamber pot, and on the wall, scratched into the plaster, a series of marks that appeared to be a tally of days. This was a safe room, Dr. Hayes explained, a place where enslaved people could hide if they were attempting to escape. The marks on the wall suggest that someone spent a considerable amount of time here, possibly weeks or months. The discovery raised new questions. Had Sarah hidden here before being taken away, or had someone else used this room? The answer came from an unexpected source. A woman named Dorothy Hutchins, a descendant of Ruth, Sarah's mother, came forward with a family story that had been passed down through generations. Dorothy was in her 70s, and she had lived in the valley her entire life. Her family had roots in the area stretching back to the time of slavery, and she had grown up hearing stories about her ancestors, about the people who had worked at Belle Grove and other plantations. According to the family story that Dorothy shared, Ruth had helped several enslaved people escape north during the Civil War. She had hidden them in a room beneath the main house and had provided them with food and supplies. One of the people she had helped was her own daughter Sarah, who had hidden in the room for several weeks before being smuggled north by members of the Underground Railroad. But the story had another version, one that Dorothy's grandmother had told her in private years before she died. According to this version, Sarah had not been taken to an asylum by her father. Instead, she had hidden in the room beneath the house, and when Union soldiers came through the valley, she had escaped with them, heading north to freedom. The letters in the journal that Catherine had hidden, they were a cover story, a way of protecting Ruth and the other enslaved people who had helped Sarah escape. My grandmother said that Ruth told her years later that Sarah had made it to Philadelphia. Dorothy explained in an interview with Dr. Hayes. She said that Sarah had changed her name and had lived a quiet life working as a seamstress. She had married a free man of color and had children. She had never returned to Virginia, but she had sent letters, anonymous letters to Ruth, letting her know that she was alive and well. Dr. Hayes was skeptical of this version of events. The letters from Henry Ashton to Dr. Whitfield seemed to clearly indicate that Sarah had been sent to an asylum, but she acknowledged that the truth might be more complicated than the document suggested. It's possible, she said carefully, that Catherine's journal and Henry's letters were deliberately misleading. It's possible that they were written to create a false narrative to protect Sarah and the people who helped her escape. If that's the case, then Catherine's act of hiding these documents wasn't just about preserving the truth. It was about protecting her stepdaughter, even if she couldn't do so openly. The discovery sparked a new round of research. Dr. Hayes and her team began searching for records of Sarah in Philadelphia, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, and they found something. In the 1880 census for Philadelphia, there was a listing for a woman named Sarah Mitchell, age 35, occupation seamstress, married to a man named Thomas Mitchell, a laborer. The household also included 3 children, James, age 12, Catherine, age 10, and Ruth, age 7. The names were significant. Catherine, named after the woman who had hidden the journal. Ruth, named after her grandmother. It seemed too much of a coincidence to be anything else. But there was no way to be absolutely certain. The census records didn't include photographs or detailed biographical information. It was possible that this Sarah Mitchell was a different person entirely, someone who just happened to have the same name and the same occupation. But the combination of factors, the name, the age, the occupation, the names of the children, suggested that this was indeed the Sarah who had been hidden away at Belle Grove. Dr. Hayes decided to pursue this lead further. She traveled to Philadelphia and spent several weeks researching Sarah Mitchell in the city's archives. She found property records showing that Thomas and Sarah Mitchell had owned a small house in a neighborhood with a significant free black population. She found records of Sarah's work as a seamstress. She had apparently been quite skilled and had had a good reputation in the community. She also found something else, a death certificate for Sarah Mitchell, dated November 15, 1912. Sarah had died at the age of 67 of pneumonia. The death certificate listed her occupation as seamstress and her place of residence as Philadelphia. It listed her husband as Thomas Mitchell, deceased, and it listed her children as James, Catherine, and Ruth. She lived, Dr. Hayes said, when she returned to Virginia and shared her findings with Thomas and David. Sarah lived. She escaped. She made it to Philadelphia. She built a life for herself. She had a husband. She had children. She had a career. She lived for 49 years after she left the valley. But we still don't know for certain, David said. We don't know if this Sarah Mitchell was the same Sarah who was at Belle Grove. No, Dr. Hayes agreed. We don't know for certain, but the evidence is compelling. The names of the children, the occupation, the age, the location, it all fits. And I think that's the point. I think Catherine understood that the truth would always be ambiguous, that we would never know with absolute certainty what happened to Sarah. But she wanted to create a record, a trail of breadcrumbs that would allow someone someday to piece together the story. The restoration of Belle Grove was completed in 1989, 2 years after the initial discovery. The house was opened to the public as a historic site with a new interpretation that included the story of Sarah and the hidden journal. The room where the items had been found was preserved as it had been, with the floorboard carefully restored and a small plaque explaining what had been discovered beneath it. The Preservation Foundation created an exhibit about slavery at Belle Grove, featuring Catherine's journal, Henry's letters, and the daguerreotype of the young woman whose identity had been hidden for more than a century. They also created a memorial to the enslaved people who had lived and worked at the plantation with names and brief biographical information for those whose records had survived. The discovery had a profound impact on how the community understood its own history. It forced a reckoning with the reality of slavery and its aftermath, not as something distant and abstract, but as something that had happened in their own valley to people whose descendants still lived in the area. Marcus Webb became something of a local historian, giving tours at Belle Grove and speaking to school groups about the valley's history. He worked with Dr. Hayes to compile an oral history of the region, interviewing elderly residents about their family histories and their memories of the valley before and after the Civil War. He also worked with Dorothy Hutchins to document the family stories that had been passed down through generations, creating a record of the experiences of enslaved people and their descendants. Dorothy Hutchins established a scholarship fund in the name of Ruth and Sarah to be awarded to descendants of enslaved people from the Valley who were pursuing higher education. The fund was small at first, but it grew as more people learned about the story and chose to contribute. Within 10 years, the fund had awarded scholarships to more than 50 students. Thomas Garrett continued his restoration work, but Belgrove remained his most significant project. He was invited to speak at conferences about the ethical responsibilities of preservationists, about the importance of uncovering and telling the complete history of historic sites, even when that history was uncomfortable or painful. He became an advocate for what he called honest restoration. The idea that when you restore a historic building, you have a responsibility to tell the complete story of that building, including the difficult and uncomfortable parts. David Garrett, Thomas's nephew, decided to pursue a degree in history after the discovery at Belgrove. He went on to become a historian himself, specializing in the social history of the Civil War era and the experiences of enslaved people in the Upper South. He published several books about the Valley's history and became a respected voice in discussions about how to interpret and present the history of slavery in America. In the years that followed, researchers continued to investigate the story of Sarah and her family. Dr. Hayes eventually published a book about Belgrove and the Ashton family titled Hidden Beneath: The Untold Story of Sarah Ashton and the Secrets of Belgrove Plantation. The book became a regional bestseller and was adopted by several universities as a text for courses on American history and the history of slavery. The question of whether Sarah had actually been sent to an asylum or had escaped north remained somewhat ambiguous. The documentary evidence, Henry's letters in Catherine's journal, suggested one narrative, while the family oral history suggested another. But Dr. Hayes argued that this ambiguity was itself significant. It reflected the reality of the historical record, which is often incomplete and contradictory, and it reflected the ways in which enslaved people and their descendants had to hide their stories in order to survive. The truth, Dr. Hayes wrote in her conclusion, is that we may never know with absolute certainty what happened to Sarah Ashton. But what we do know is that she was a person whose existence was denied, whose identity was erased, whose story was buried beneath the floorboards of a house that was meant to represent the grandeur and permanence of the Old South. The discovery of Catherine's journal and Henry's letters gives us the opportunity to remember her, to acknowledge her existence, and to recognize the profound injustice that was done to her and to countless others like her. The daguerreotype of the young woman, the photograph that had been hidden for more than a century, was carefully preserved and displayed at Belgrove. Visitors to the site would stand before it and wonder about the woman in the photograph, about her life and her fate, about the secrets that had been kept from her, and about her. Some people who visited Belgrove reported feeling a strange sense of sadness in the house, particularly in the bedroom where the journal had been found. They described it as a heaviness in the air, a sense of unresolved grief. Others dismissed this as mere suggestion, the power of knowing the story. But whether it was psychological or something else, the feeling was real enough to those who experienced it. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, the Preservation Foundation held a special dedication ceremony at Belgrove. They unveiled a memorial to Sarah Ashton and to all the enslaved people who had lived and worked at the plantation. The memorial was a simple stone placed in the garden behind the house with an inscription that read in memory of Sarah Ashton and all those whose names were forgotten. May we remember them with truth and honor. Marcus Webb, now in his 80s, attended the ceremony. He stood before the memorial for a long time, his hand resting on the stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "My great-grandmother," he said, "never knew what happened to her children. She died not knowing if they were alive or dead, free or enslaved. But Sarah's story, at least we know her story now. At least we can remember her. That's something. It's not enough, but it's something." Dorothy Hutchkins stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. She thought about her grandmother, about the stories that had been passed down through her family, about the resilience of people who had survived slavery and its aftermath. She thought about Sarah, about the courage it must have taken to escape, to build a new life, to send anonymous letters back to her mother to let her know that she was alive. "She made it," Dorothy said softly. "Sarah made it. She got away. She had a family. She had a life. That's what I want people to know. That's what I want to remember. The story of Belle Grove and the discovery of Catherine's journal continued to resonate in the years that followed. The house became one of the most visited historic sites in Virginia, attracting thousands of visitors each year. School groups came to learn about slavery and the Civil War. Historians came to study the documents. Descendants of the Ashton family came to confront their family's history. The Preservation Foundation used the discovery as an opportunity to expand their work. They began investigating the histories of other plantations in the valley, looking for similar hidden records, similar stories of people who had been erased from history. They found other journals, other letters, other evidence of the lives of enslaved people and the moral struggles of some of the people who enslaved them. Dr. Hayes continued her work as a historian, but she became increasingly focused on the question of how we remember the past. She gave lectures at universities across the country about the importance of uncovering hidden histories, about the ethical responsibilities of historians and preservationists, about the ways in which the past continues to shape the present. History is not just about what happened, she would say in her lectures. It's about who gets to tell the story, whose voices are heard, whose stories are remembered. When we find documents like Catherine's journal, we're not just finding historical artifacts. We are finding evidence of people who tried to preserve the truth, who tried to make sure that the people they cared about would not be completely forgotten. And we have a responsibility to honor that effort, to tell those stories, to make sure that those voices are heard. Thomas Garrett eventually retired from his restoration work, but he remained involved with Belle Grove. He served on the board of the Preservation Foundation and continued to advise on restoration projects. He also became a mentor to younger preservationists, teaching them not just the technical skills of restoration, but also the ethical dimensions of the work. When you restore a house, he would tell his students, you're not just fixing the physical structure, you're engaging with history. You're making decisions about what to preserve, what to change, what to reveal. And those decisions have consequences. They shape how people understand the past. So, you have to be thoughtful about it. You have to be honest about it. You have to be willing to uncover uncomfortable truths. David Garrett's career as a historian took him to universities across the country, but he always maintained his connection to Belle Grove. He would return to the valley regularly to work on research projects, to give lectures, to mentor students. He also worked with the Preservation Foundation to develop new interpretive materials about the house and its history. In 2003, David published a book titled Voices from the Quarters: The Lives of Enslaved People at Belle Grove Plantation. The book drew on the research that had been conducted over the previous 15 years combining documentary evidence with oral histories and archaeological findings. It told the stories of the people who had lived and worked at Belgrove, giving them names and faces and voices. The book included a chapter devoted entirely to Sarah Ashton. In that chapter, David presented both versions of her story, the official version suggested by Henry's letters and Catherine's journal, and the family oral history that suggested she had escaped to Philadelphia. He acknowledged that we would probably never know, with absolute certainty, what had happened to her, but he argued that the search for the truth was itself important, that the effort to recover her story was a way of honoring her memory. As the years passed, the mystery of Sarah Ashton continued to fascinate researchers and visitors to Belgrove. The question of what had actually happened to her, whether she had been sent to an asylum or had escaped to freedom, remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Some researchers argued that the evidence clearly indicated that she had been sent to Dr. Croft's asylum. The letters from Henry Ashton and Dr. Whitfield seemed to document the transaction in detail. The letter from Dr. Croft confirming her admission appeared to be definitive proof. If she had escaped to Philadelphia, they argued, then why would Catherine have written about it in such anguished terms? Why would she have hidden the journal beneath the floorboards? Other researchers argued that Catherine's anguish could be explained by her guilt over her complicity in the plan to send Sarah away, even if that plan had ultimately failed. They pointed to the family oral history as evidence that Sarah had indeed escaped. They noted that the names of Sarah Mitchell's children in the 1880 census, Catherine and Ruth, seemed too much of a coincidence to be anything else. They argued that Catherine had written the journal and hidden the letters as a way of creating a false narrative that would protect Sarah and the people who had helped her escape. Dr. Hayes, in her later writings, came to believe that the truth was probably somewhere in between. She suggested that Catherine might have believed that Sarah was being sent to an asylum, but that Ruth and others had actually helped Sarah escape before she could be taken away. Catherine's journal would then represent her understanding of what had happened, not necessarily what had actually occurred. The letters from Henry and Dr. Croft might have been part of an elaborate deception, a way of creating a false trail that would throw off anyone who might be looking for Sarah. The beauty of this story, Dr. Hayes wrote, is that we may never know the truth with absolute certainty. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps it reflects the reality of the historical record, which is always incomplete, always subject to interpretation. What we do know is that Sarah Ashton was a real person, that her life mattered, that people cared enough about her to try to protect her, whether by hiding her away or by helping her escape. And that's what we should remember. The discovery at Belgrove had a lasting impact on how Americans understood and interpreted the history of slavery. It became a case study in how historical truth can be hidden, how documents can be misinterpreted, how the past can be deliberately obscured. It also became a powerful example of how ordinary people, like Catherine Ashton, could resist the systems in which they lived, even if their resistance was limited and imperfect. The Preservation Foundation's work at Belgrove inspired similar projects at other historic sites across the South. Historians and preservationists began to look more carefully at the documents in their collections, searching for hidden narratives, for evidence of the lives of enslaved people, for records of moral struggle and resistance. The story of Belgrove also became important in discussions about reparations and historical justice. Some people argued that the discovery of Sarah's story was evidence of the need for a more complete accounting of the harms of slavery, for a more honest engagement with the past. Others argued that the story showed the possibility of reconciliation, of people from different backgrounds coming together to understand and honor the past. In 2010, the Preservation Foundation established the Sarah Ashton Center for Historical Justice at Belgrove. The center was dedicated to researching and interpreting the histories of enslaved people and their descendants, to training historians and preservationists in methods of uncovering hidden histories, and to promoting honest and inclusive interpretations of historic sites. The center became a hub for research on the valley's history. Scholars from across the country came to Belgrove to conduct research, to access the archives, to participate in seminars and workshops. The center also worked with descendants of enslaved people and their family to document oral histories and to ensure that their voices were heard in the interpretation of the past. The mystery of Belgrove and the secrets hidden beneath its floorboards remind us that history is not always what we think it is. The past is not safely contained in textbooks and museums. It lives in the places around us, in the old houses and the forgotten graves, in the stories that families pass down through generations. And sometimes when we're not looking for it, when we're simply doing the work of restoration and preservation, we stumble upon truths that have been deliberately hidden, truths that demand to be acknowledged and remembered. The question that remains, even after all the research and investigation, is this: did Sarah escape to freedom in Philadelphia, or did she spend her life in an asylum in North Carolina? The documents suggest one answer, but the family stories suggest another. And perhaps that ambiguity is the most honest reflection of what we can know about the past. That it is often incomplete, often contradictory, and that the truth is sometimes hidden, not just in physical spaces, but in the gaps between different versions of events. What we do know is this: Sarah Ashton was a real person. She was intelligent and beautiful and brave. She was loved by her mother, Ruth, and by Catherine Ashton, who risked her own moral standing to try to protect her. She was feared by her father, Henry Ashton, who saw her as a threat to his way of life. And she was remembered more than a century after she disappeared by people who found her story in a journal hidden beneath the floorboards of an old house. That memory, that act of remembering, is perhaps the most important part of the story. Because in a world that tried to erase her, that tried to make her disappear, that tried to deny her very existence, Catherine Ashton made sure that someone would know, someone would remember, someone would tell her story. And we have, what do you think happened to Sarah? Do you believe she escaped to freedom in Philadelphia? Or do you think she was sent away as her father intended? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries and history. See you in the next